So when John Kennedy was inaugurated as president in January 1961, he made one of the more famous inaugural addresses in U.S. history when he uttered the famous phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And there was one young man, an African-American veteran of the Air Force, James Meredith, who was inspired by that speech. And it moved him to attempt to register at the all-white University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. The university admissions office turned down his application in spite of his excellent service record, his excellent grades, and he filed a lawsuit, and a federal court ruled that the university had to admit him as a student. On September 30th, an agitated mob of students and non-students from across the South rioted on the campus. In fact, there's going to be right-wing activists who come from Dallas to go to that particular riot, and you're going to have 160 marshals in this riot. U.S. Marshals wounded. 28 are going to be hit by bullets. 2 men are killed. Jukebox repairman who happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and a French news cameraman. Monitoring the events from television throughout the night and from telephone calls, etc., President Kennedy has to order 5,000 Army troops to the campus before dawn to restore order. Now, Martin Luther King realized they would take more dramatic direct action to keep the administration focused on the issue of desegregation. So in Birmingham, Alabama, they began staging boycotts of downtown department stores during Easter time. And this is really strategic because Easter is a big holiday in the African-American community. And it's traditional for African-American families to spend quite a bit of money on Easter dresses for the girls, Easter suits for the boys. Mom and dad dress up in their Sunday best. That's a big time for merchants in Birmingham, Alabama with black customers. And if they boycott, that's going to hit them in the pocketbooks, those stores. Now, let's be clear, the stores in Birmingham, Alabama would not let, just like they wouldn't in Dallas, they would not let black customers try on clothes. They had to buy them and then alter them, hope they fit, whatever. And they, like in Dallas, they had to buy any products they touched. Now, the boycotts and sit-ins in Birmingham began April 3rd, 1963, but after 8 days of protests, a state court orders King to stop the campaign. He refuses to do so. He says, no, I won't stop the campaign. And he gets arrested. And the timing couldn't have been more symbolic or in an odd way inspiring for the civil rights movement. King spends 3 days in jail, Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And while he's there, he's going to write one of the most important pieces of literature in U.S. history. We're going to look at a picture here. Here is King getting booked in. There he is in his jail cell. He's in the prison cell, or the jail cell rather, and a trustee is an inmate of a jail who's given jobs because the police trust him. So an African-American trustee sneaks a pen and scraps of paper to Martin Luther King while he's there, and he writes what comes to be known as a letter from a Birmingham jail. A bunch of white liberals in the town and across the South said, King, you're pushing things too fast. You're going to cause a backlash. You need to be patient. You need to wait till it's the right time. And King rejects that because he points out African Americans had been waiting for freedom since the first slave ships arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s. He says it's always easy to tell someone else to wait. And so he says this in his letter. He says, perhaps It is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious lynch mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you see hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you take a cross-country drive and you find it's necessary to sleep at night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it is difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. King is released April 20th of that year. So the protests continue, and they run out of adults to go to the prison. And so King and his top lieutenants recruit high school students to participate in the protest. By May 2nd, more than 900 children had gone to jail protesting segregation. And on May 3rd, the Alabama police go on a violent rampage. This is a current thing. This is an era in which police violence is rampant. And we'll look at this later. But anyway, there's kickings or beatings. They use the fire hoses on these demonstrators. And what this does is people are afraid to go to downtown Birmingham to shop. White customers aren't going either, and black customers are boycotting. So the merchants are facing pressure. Their northern suppliers, the businesses that are giving those Birmingham stores the products they sell, are saying, you've got to make this stop because we're going to be held responsible. In fact, those suppliers are beginning to be boycotted as well. So the downtown merchants work out a compromise with King on May 10th. In return for the desegregation of the stores, the protesters will end the boycott. Approximately 75,000 Americans are going to participate in civil rights marches, boycotts, demonstrations like this in May 1963 alone. Now, in Alabama, this man won election as governor in 1962. His name is George Corley Wallace. Let's note something again. Once again, we see what? The Confederate battle flag. And a politician winning office on a platform of racism. Wallace is interesting. Wallace actually wants to expand in Alabama the social safety net. He wants to provide more social services. But he loses an election earlier in his career to someone who was more extreme in bringing up race. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase this time, I'm never going to be out N-word again. I'm never going to let someone be more racist than I am on the campaign. He decided that was the key to winning elections. And when he's sworn in as governor of Alabama, January 14th, 1963, in his speech, he says this, and we're going to listen to a passage here of his speech. Make sure we have enough volume here. Here we go. This is him at the speaker stand.
Name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Let us send this message back to Washington by our representatives who are here with us today, that from this day we are standing up, and the heel of tyranny does not fit the neck of an upright man, that we intend to take the offensive and carry our fight for freedom across this nation, wielding the balance of power we know we possess in the Southland, that we, not the insipid black voters of some sections, will determine in the next election who shall sit in the White House of these United States.
So, I want you to note something about right-wing rhetoric. We see this all the time. We see that people who oppose the freedom of human beings to vote, the freedom to sit at a lunch counter and get served, the freedom to sit on a bus and not have your dignity assaulted. The people who take away those freedoms present themselves as people battling against tyranny. There's a book by George Orwell called 1984, in which words, the meaning of words are inverted to their opposite meaning. We see this in American politics all the time, and we see this with George Wallace. George Wallace in 1963 in the fall, at the beginning of the semester at the University of Alabama, is going to personally block the entry into the campus at Foster Auditorium. Vivian Malone and James Hood, two African Americans who had obtained a court order allowing them to enroll in the school, the University of Alabama. He stands there in opposition. Now, so much of this is so cynical. Actually, Wallace had already worked out a deal with the Kennedy administration. And so he's allowed to make his speech with the TV cameras rolling, saying how he sees this as a big intrusion of federal power, oppressing the rights of states, violating states' rights. And then, following the deal, he then steps aside and the two students go inside and they get to enroll. Now, Kennedy is going to nationalize the Alabama National Guard in this case to guarantee Wallace's compliance. And he makes one of his most important speeches as president that night. He says, quote, "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It's as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for public officials who represent him, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in this place? Who among us would be content to the counsels of patience and delay? Are we to say to the world that this is a land of the free except for Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system? No ghettos, no master race except with respect to Negroes? The same evening Kennedy makes that speech, something happens in Mississippi. The field secretary of the Mississippi NAACP, Medgar Evers, is shot to death in the driveway of his home in Jackson. And I've got a photo here of this is Medgar Evers, striking man, brave man fighting for voting rights in a state where mere political activism can be a death sentence. And there he is, there are the police investigating the murder at his home. On June 19th, 1963, the president submits to the Congress a sweeping civil rights bill that strengthens voting rights laws, empowers the Attorney General to file school desegregation lawsuits, gives the president power to end federal funding of state programs that racially discriminate, and outlaws segregation in public accommodations such as restaurants, movie theaters, hotels and motels, stores and stadiums. Now, to put pressure on the president and the Congress, because the civil rights movement knows that white people make promises and then they compromise away until what's left is minimal. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders are going to organize a March on Washington. Remember, we talked earlier about a March on Washington that was planned in 1941. They got Roosevelt to sign an anti-discrimination presidential order in defense industries. Well, this is building on that. And A. Philip Randolph, who was involved in that 1941 effort, is going to be involved in this 1963 effort. Now, the Kennedys are against the rally. They're afraid that wavering members of Congress who are worried about backlash should they support a civil rights bill might actually back down and not support it. Violence may break out, they were worried. You have, oh, by the way, the Washington police closed down all the bars because they're afraid that African Americans are going to go there and drink and get violent. That's the racism in the Washington Police Department. They're worried that a small turnout would undermine support for the bill. No one will show up, and then there'll be no momentum for the bill. Well, it becomes quite apparent that the march is going to take place anyway. So then the Kennedy team essentially stage manages the event. They begin to insist that speeches, and the movement agrees to have the speeches vetted by the Kennedy administration. John Lewis, who's later a congressman, who was one of the Freedom Riders, wrote a really fiery speech he had to water down because the Kennedy administration insisted on it. Well, they're worried about a small crowd. 250,000 people show up, August 28th, 1963. And the world is going to listen and forever remember as national TV broadcast one of the most famous speeches in American history, the I Have a Dream speech. And King is going to speak he's going to switch codes. He'll talk to, the black preacher voice, and then he'll try to reach to white audiences, and it blends seamlessly. And one of the things I'm sad about is how this speech has been boiled down to one sentiment, the idea of racial equality, while King is much more challenging to the white power structure. And he makes demands, and his demands are seen as radical at the time. He says this passage that you don't hear usually on MLK Day. He says, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodgings in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We can no longer be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a large one. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes that he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." That is a speech insisting on fundamental change, not simply celebrating brotherhood, which is, and that's the thing that's happened with King as they watered down his legacy to turn his sentiments into a Hallmark greeting card. King was much more powerful and radical than he's been reduced to in memory. Now, rather than provoke backlash, the reaction overall to the rally the march is extremely positive. In fact, Kennedy didn't want to go to the rally or the march. He didn't speak, but he met King afterwards. And when he shook hands with King, Kennedy says, "I have a dream." And so that bill, that civil rights bill they're talking about, is going to be approved by the House Judiciary Committee and referred to the full House October 23rd, 1963. Whatever euphoria, however, civil rights activists might have had in the wake of the March on Washington is going to give way to bitter tears on September 15th, 1963. That Sunday, an explosion rocks the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham during services. A bomber had tunneled under the church basement and set off a bundle of dynamite underneath the girls' restroom, killing 4 young girls dressed in white. Three 14-year-olds named Cynthia Wessler, Carol Robertson, and Addie Mae Collins, and an 11-year-old named Denise McNair. The explosion took place during the church's annual Youth Day. It injures 20 other worshipers. When the bomb explodes, Sunday school students had just studied the day's topic, the love that forgives. McNair's father, upon discovering the body, stood holding one of her white dress shoes, and he screams, "I'd like to blow the whole town up." So, here we go. This is a picture of King at the I Have a Dream speech at a professor who was actually there that I had at the University of California, Riverside. And here's the scene of the bombing. And here are the 4 little girls. And by the way, there's an excellent documentary called 4 Little Girls, made by Spike Lee. That's worth watching. Now, the United Klans of America had targeted the church because it had served as a meeting place for civil rights leaders. Remember, we spoke about Alabama Governor George Wallace. He had been exploiting racial tensions for months to enhance his popularity with white voters. And 1 week before the explosion, the New York Times published an interview with Wallace in which he said the state, to end these disturbances, needed a few, quote, first-class funerals. It was not until November 1977 that the bomber, Robert Chambliss, was found guilty and sent to prison. Juries eventually convicted 3 other accomplices and sentenced them to prison terms as well. King, however, blamed Wallace, writing to him, quote, "The blood of 4 little girls is on your hands. Your irresponsible and misguided actions have created in Birmingham and Alabama the atmosphere that has induced continued violence and now murder." Sorrow and anger over the bombing did, however, intensify the efforts to pass major civil rights legislation in 1964. John Kennedy was, in fact, murdered in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. And many civil rights workers, activists, were deeply worried about his successor, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, early in his congressional career, had been a segregationist. Now, when he was in Texas and he was an administrator for some New Deal programs, he had made sure that programs were available for African-American children, Mexican-American children. He had times seemed to be a progressive on the issue in Texas, in the Texas context. But he had been a segregationist when he first got to Congress. Now, in 1957, he helped steer through legislation in the Senate that's mild, but it's one of the first civil rights bills since Reconstruction. And that was enough for all the other Southern senators to think both Texas senators, Ralph Yarborough and Lyndon Johnson, were traitors. And when they plotted to block integration, they made sure they excluded Yarborough and Lyndon Johnson. He's a complicated figure, in many ways Shakespearean in his tragic flaws and his great skills. Often crude, he nevertheless proves to be one of the most successful and clever political tacticians of his era. A small-town Southerner, Johnson would use the N-word in private conversation, but still he devoted much of his presidency to advancing civil rights and fighting poverty. An inveterate compromiser, he would also propose some of the boldest legislation in American history in terms of expanding the social safety net. If you're going to rate presidents in terms of their liberalism, LBJ is considerably to the left of Franklin Roosevelt, and FDR was Johnson's hero. Now, Johnson sees an opportunity to move civil rights legislation forward after Kennedy's death. He writes, or he says at one point, quote, "Everything I had learned from history taught me that martyrs have to die for causes. John Kennedy died, but his cause was not really clear. That was my job. I had to take a dead man's program and turn it into a martyr's cause." And that's what he does. And he takes the unfinished, unpassed Kennedy Civil Rights Bill, and he actually expands it and makes it much stronger. And that's one of the ironies, that this big civil rights bill, one of the most important pieces of legislation in U.S. history, was pushed through the Congress by a white Southerner who had been a segregationist. And by the way, he wouldn't have been able to do it without the movement. The movement is what's really driving this. So he frequently mentions Kennedy's name. He cajoles the Congress towards passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This law is going to ban segregation at public facilities and racial discrimination in workplace. It's going to empower the U.S. Attorney General to initiate lawsuits against segregated schools. It's going to allow, and this is really important, this is one of the things that drives at least legal integration to schools that are still resisting and dragging their feet. Under this bill, the federal government can withhold school funds, federal funds from schools that don't comply with desegregation orders, and that moves things. It's undermined by the fact that white parents, when they see black people attending their schools, begin to move to the suburbs, which are all white. It's called white flight. However, the front lines for social justice are not going to be found in Washington, D.C., but in the backwoods of Mississippi. A younger generation of black protesters are not content to wait upon the slow workings of the United States Senate. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, we refer to, has a younger membership. They prefer direct action. Rather than waiting on legislature or filing lawsuits, they're going to break segregation laws. They're going to register voters. And they, by the way, this generation is beginning to resent King and other civil rights celebrities, as they call them, because they say King and others just swoop into a town, they start a movement, and then before the battle's won, they leave. And then those people get the headlines, and the people left behind often suffer the retaliation and are left to do the work to finish the job. Now, SNCC, the NAACP, and the Congress of Racial Equality is going to launch a voter education project in April 1962. Over the next 2 years, the project registers for the vote more than 500,000 African Americans in the South. The problem is the overwhelming majority of these voters live in big cities in the South. Large numbers of rural Southern blacks remain unregistered. In Mississippi, the project adds only 4,000 new voters. Just under 400,000 African Americans in Mississippi remain unregistered by 1964, almost 500,000. By 1964, even though African Americans make up 42% of the total population, they comprise 6.7% of the voters. Now, Mississippi becomes the focus of the registration drive. Now, having seen so many African Americans injured or killed over civil rights, SNCC's leadership makes a strategic decision. Let's bring in some white folks. Let's see how much attention these drives get if white kids are in danger. And so they invite the participation of white students from colleges like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford to participate in what becomes known as the Freedom Summer in 1964. Most of the 900 student volunteers who arrive from out of state are from well-off white families going to expensive universities. Civil rights are going to dominate the headlines in 1964. The 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution banning poll taxes had been submitted to the states in 1962. It's ratified January 23rd, 1964. Meanwhile, the Freedom Summer becomes a big story, as SNCC leaders predicted. These activists are not only going to register black voters, they're going to set up 30 freedom schools, as they call them, to offer black children an alternative to the state's dilapidated Jim Crow underfunded schools. And those students are going to learn and taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're going to learn about African American history. They're going to learn about African history. They're going to be taught lessons on the importance of voting and the philosophy of the civil rights movement. CORE and other groups help organize what comes to be known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an alternative to the Democratic Party in Mississippi. The Democratic Party, the official party, is totally in the hands of white segregationists. So they're going to hold their own primaries. and they're going to nominate their own candidates, and they're going to elect delegates to the National Convention, the Democratic National Convention in 1964. They're going to go there in Atlantic City. They're going to challenge the credentials of that all-white delegation and demand that the National Democratic Party recognize the integrated slate of the Freedom Party, which, by the way, uses a Black Panther as its symbol. They're going to demand that that be seated as the legitimate delegates from the state of Mississippi when the convention in the summer happens that nominates Johnson for a term in his own right. Two young white New Yorkers, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, joined the Freedom Summer campaign. And on June 21st, they travel with a local African-American man, James Chaney, to investigate the burning of Mount Zion United Methodist Church, the spiritual home of a black congregation in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The local Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council closely monitors the movements of these three, and the Neshoba County Deputy, Cecil Price, County Deputy, arrests these three men allegedly for speeding. While they're in jail, Price makes a phone call to his Klan buddies. He's a member of the Klan. He says, I'm about to release them. And he arranges for a car full of Klansmen to cut them off while he follows them in his police car. And so they ambush the three. They force them out of the car. They beat them. They were beaten so badly, a police investigator later says their bones were crushed. And then they're shot. Well, President Johnson is going to send FBI agents to swarm the area near Philadelphia, which is kind of strange because the FBI, in fact, was a racist institution. And the only FBI employee at that point was a black driver for J. Edgar Hoover. And he thought the civil rights movement was caused by the communists from the Soviet Union, that it was a communist conspiracy. But anyway, they pay $25,000 to an FBI informant who tells them you can find the bodies at the dam near the Bogue Cheeto swamp. Navy divers, FBI agents find not only the bodies of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, but the corpses of 7 other black men murdered over the years had been dumped there. The U.S. government is eventually going to secure an indictment against these men involved. By the way, here we see, this is Johnson delivering his first speech to Congress after Kennedy is murdered. These are Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. They're missing at this point. They haven't been found. There's the photo of them, Goodman, Chaney, Schwerner. And by the way, here are 2 of the men on trial for the murder, Bill Reed and Lawrence Rainey. You see the arrogant attitude. And by the way, this was turned into a poster in the 1960s. People satirizing police brutality would put up, have this picture on posters that say, support your local police. This became a symbol of the racism and arrogance and indifference to human suffering of police departments. Well, Price, Neshoba County Sheriff Lawrence Rainey, 16 other defendants are indicted, and they're charged with denying Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman of their civil rights. A jury is going to find 7 of the defendants, including Price and Klan Imperial Wizard Samuel Bowers, guilty on October 20th, 1967. Authorities are going to release all of those convicted within 6 years. After an investigation by a Mississippi journalist and high school students competing on a National History Day contest, gathered enough evidence, you're going to have the arrest and conviction for murder of another killer, a preacher named Edgar Ray Killen in 2005. He recently died. He was 80 when he was convicted. He receives a sentence of 3 consecutive 20-year sentences. As I said, he died in prison. The murder of these three men will make a big impact, and in fact, it's going to turn public sentiment strongly in favor of the second big civil rights law passed in the 1960s, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We'll talk about that next time.